Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by English BookCast.
Great to be here.
Today, we're taking a really critical look into a pretty monumental work, Quem Manda no Mundo. That translates from Portuguese to Who Rules the World?
Right, by Noam Chomsky, published back in 2017.
Exactly. And this book, it's a powerful collection of essays. It really challenges the mainstream narratives we hear all the time.
It definitely does. It offers a, let's say, stark perspective on global power, history, and some really critical issues facing all of us.
So our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack Chomsky's core arguments, his key insights. We want to help you navigate the complex web of information he presents.
It's dense stuff, but important.
It really is. What if the world you think you understand, is actually run by just a select few, operating behind this kind of veil of conventional wisdom?
And what if the biggest threats we face, climate change, nuclear war, are actually being made worse by these very power structures?
That's the core of it. So prepare for some maybe surprising facts and probably some profound aha moments as we explore who Chomsky thinks truly governs, this idea of historical amnesia he talks about, and the urgent threats looming large.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging read, but I think essential. Chomsky, he's meticulous with his documentation, and he really tries to pull back the curtain.
He urges us to question the stories we just accept, right? To look for where the real control lies.
Exactly, to look deeper.
Okay, let's get into it then. Section 1, the architecture of global power and the illusion of influence. Chomsky kind of throws us right into the deep end here. He suggests that, despite maybe talk of Washington's power declining, it's actually shared within what he calls a de facto world government.
Which sounds conspiratorial, maybe, but he doesn't mean a literal government building somewhere.
Right, not a formal thing with a flag, more like a shadowy collective, dominated by what he calls the masters of the universe.
That's his term, yeah.
So what exactly does he mean by that? Who are these masters?
Well, it's important to get that he's not pointing to, like, one specific leader or one capital city being in charge. It's a network.
Okay.
The masters of the universe, for him, are primarily the major capitalist powers. He specifically highlights the Group of Seven, the G7. The wealthiest industrialized nations, U.S., Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK.
The big economic players.
Exactly. But it's not just them. This de facto government also includes the big international institutions they largely control. Think the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, global trade organizations like the WTO.
Okay, so the levers of global finance and trade.
Right. His argument is that these entities, they work together often behind the scenes within what he calls a new imperial era. They collectively shape global policy, economic structures, really the whole world order to benefit their interests.
And this power is concentrated, often deliberately hidden.
That's the idea. It's concentrated, often opaque, and works to maintain a specific status quo.
So it's this complex, interlinked system, not just one country calling the shots, which brings up a huge question for all of us listening. How does this concentrated power, often hidden from view, actually influence the policies that affect our daily lives?
Yeah, things like jobs, the economy.
Even the direction our own countries take.
That's precisely the question Chomsky forces us to ask. And he doesn't just ask it. He points to some pretty compelling evidence. Research done in the U.S., which he cites extensively.
What does the research show?
It provides what the researchers called compelling evidence. That, and I'm quoting loosely here, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy.
Okay, so the wealthy and corporations have real influence, while, and this is the kicker, ordinary citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence.
Little or no influence. That's pretty staggering.
It is. Think about that. It's not just a feeling people have. It's what rigorous academic studies found. That really shakes the foundation of democratic ideals. The idea that your vote, our collective voice, might not matter nearly as much as we think.
It certainly challenges that notion head on. And it must have, as you said, profound implications for how people engage with politics or maybe don't engage.
Yeah, definitely.
And the implications are profound. These studies, they go even further. They found that over time, campaign financing is an extraordinary predictor of political decisions.
Follow the money, basically.
Essentially, yes. It's not just about a few corrupt deals here and there. It points to a systemic pattern. If the money flowing into campaigns reliably predicts policy outcomes later on,
then the average citizen's preference gets sidelined.
It gets relegated to a secondary position, often, according to this research, a negligible one. The priorities of the donors, the funders, tend to become the priorities of the politicians and the policymakers. It creates this powerful feedback loop.
Economic power translates directly into political power.
That's the core finding.
Okay, so if that's the reality, or at least the reality presented by this research, Chomsky highlights that elite interests are effectively driving policy. What's the result for the rest of us, for the general public?
Well, it sounds like it could easily lead to just widespread disillusionment, right?
Mhm.
A feeling of, what's the point?
Exactly. Powerlessness.
And that's precisely one outcome Chomsky focuses on. Apathy. He observed that people, feeling their voices don't count, their votes don't really change things, well, they supposedly just don't bother voting. They self-exclude.
They check out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this isn't evenly distributed. This phenomena is significantly correlated with social class. Poorer people are much less likely to participate.
Which makes the system even more skewed towards the elites who do participate and fund campaigns.
Exactly. And Chomsky makes this really striking historical comparison. He says this trend recalls the early 19th century, when voting was mostly restricted to, free men who owned property.
Wow, that's a stark parallel.
It is. He notes many Americans are just disillusioned with both main political parties, feeling neither really represents them, and they're increasingly frustrated about the future, their long-term prospects.
There's this sense that someone else is pulling the strings.
Yeah, the feeling that a few and mighty individuals are in control, leaving the majority without any real say. So this apathy, Chomsky argues, isn't just laziness. It's actually a pretty rational response to a system that feels unresponsive.
That's a heavy place to start, this idea of a system demonstrably skewed, fostering apathy. It really sets the stage for looking at how these power structures maintain themselves. Which brings us to Section 2. Historical amnesia, American exceptionalism, and the roots of cruelty.
A cheerful section title.
Yeah. Chomsky opens Chapter 3 talking about the torture memos released by the White House in 2008-2009. He mentions the public reaction, bewilderment, indignation, and surprise. But he really questions that surprise. Why? Why does he find it disingenuous?
He questions it because, for him, it shows a kind of willful blindness, a refusal to connect the dots. He argues it was entirely reasonable, maybe even necessary, to assume Guantanamo Bay was a torture chamber from the start.
Why assume that?
Well, think about why prisoners were sent there in the first place, specifically to be outside the reach of law, to bypass the U.S. legal system, international treaties, everything.
Right. It was set up as a legal black hole.
Precisely. And the U.S. occupies that territory in violation of a treaty that was imposed on Cuba at gunpoint, as Chomsky puts it. So choosing a location deliberately designed to evade legal constraints, that signals an intent to operate outside normal rules.
So the surprise was the problem, not the torture itself, necessarily.
The surprise at the torture, yeah. For Chomsky, it implies ignoring the very deliberate choices made to create that extra legal space. It speaks to this deeper issue he calls historical amnesia, forgetting how we got there.
And this historical amnesia, this selective memory, seems tied into a bigger idea. Chomsky critiques heavily the myth of American exceptionalism. He brings up a British journalist, Godfrey Hodgson, who wrote a book basically concluding the U.S. is just a great but imperfect country among other countries, not uniquely virtuous or destined.
Right, challenging that core belief.
Yet, the dominant narrative, the American idea, is often framed through things like the Great Seal, symbolizing, humanitarian intervention. There's a huge gap there.
And that's where Chomsky sees the danger. This narrative of being the shining city upon a hill, a beacon of liberty, a force for good in the world. Historically, he argues, these self-proclaimed humanitarian interventions have often ended in catastrophe for their supposed beneficiaries.
He doesn't shy away from examples, does he?
No, he pulls no punches. He goes right back to the founding era. He reminds us that General Henry Knox, the first U.S. Secretary of War, described the total extirpation of all the Indians in the most populous parts of the Union as being more destructive to the natives than the conduct of the conquistadors of Mexico and Peru.
More destructive than the conquistadors. That's from a founding father.
Yes. A direct comparison acknowledged right at the start. That detail is often just left out of the standard history lessons.
It fundamentally challenges that exceptionalist self-image. And it wasn't just a brief early phase, was it? This merciless and perfidious cruelty, as he quotes later.
No, it continued systematically for decades. He quotes John Quincy Adams, who later became president, lamenting the fate of that unhappy race of North American natives, whom we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty.
He acknowledged it.
He acknowledged it,
Yeah.
but acknowledging it didn't stop it. This cruelty continued until, as Chomsky puts it, the West was conquered. And then the narrative flips.
How so?
That brutal period of conquest and extermination is often reframed, even praised, as a necessary part of nation building, of fulfilling the American idea, manifest destiny, westward expansion, all that.
Convenient narratives emerge.
Very convenient. He mentioned Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who offered this comforting explanation that the wisdom of Providence just caused the native populations to disappear, like withered and dry leaves of autumn, while the colonists, of course, had respected them.
Providence did it, not us.
Exactly. It allows a society to avoid confronting the foundational violence and maintain the myth.
So history gets actively rewritten or selectively remembered to fit this narrative of exceptionalism. And Chomsky even points to a specific concept for this kind of denial, the salty water fallacy.
Right, he borrows that from the historian Bernard Porter, the salty water fallacy.
What's the idea there?
It's the idea that conquest only really counts as imperialism if it involves crossing salty water, oceans.
So conquering overseas is imperialism, but conquering land next door isn't.
That's the fallacy. It allows the U.S., for instance, to deny the imperial nature of its own westward expansion. The violent takeover of Native American lands, the displacement, the massacres, that wasn't imperialism by this logic because it happened on the same continent.
It's a way to sanitize it.
Precisely. It's a rhetorical trick, a psychological justification that helps maintain the myth of inherent benevolence and avoids confronting the internal colonization.
That's a really powerful insight into narrative construction. And this pattern cruelty, followed by amnesia or justification, seems to echo in more recent history too, like with the CIA's torture paradigm you mentioned.
Absolutely. Chomsky emphasizes this wasn't just a few rogue agents acting out.
It was a system.
A highly developed system. The CIA's torture paradigm, he points out, was developed over 60 years, at an annual cost, adjusted for inflation, of maybe $1 billion, researching and refining methods of enhanced interrogation.
60 years. That's a long-term project.
It is. And the historian Alfred McCoy, who Chomsky cites, meticulously documented how these techniques were refined back in the 1950s, focusing on psychological torment, sensory deprivation, self-inflicted pain, things designed to break someone mentally rather than just physically.
Those same techniques reappeared decades later.
They reappeared with little alteration at places like Abu Ghraib. And these weren't just used in the War on Terror. These methods were exported, applied globally, especially in Latin America during the Cold War.
Who are they used on there?
Often targeting labor organizers, unionists, peasant leaders, human rights activists, anyone seen as opposing U.S.-backed regimes or U.S. corporate interests.
Then investigations into this stopped.
Chomsky notes that scientific investigations looking into the clear links between U.S. training programs for foreign military police and the subsequent use of these torture methods, those investigations were basically shut down during the Reagan years. Why? Because the connections were becoming too clear, too politically damaging.
That's chilling. A systematic program developed, deployed, and then actively covered up. And then, when the torture memos did come out, President Obama advised looking forward, not backward.
Yes, and his Justice Department actively fought court decisions, like Rasool v. Rumsfeld, that tried to challenge things like indefinite detention without due process.
So it suggests a continuity, or at least a reluctance to hold power accountable.
It certainly raises that question. Obama's look-forward stance effectively granted immunity to high-ranking officials who authorized torture. It signaled that past actions were off-limits for prosecution, which implicitly keeps similar options potentially available for the future.
And Chomsky uses a hypothetical to highlight the double standard here, doesn't he?
He does, a very powerful one. He asks us to imagine if Nicaragua, a country that was under attack by U.S.-backed Contra-terrorists at the time, had captured a U.S. pilot like Eugene Hassenfuss, who was caught flying weapons to the Contras.
Okay.
What if Nicaragua had then used the CIA's own torture methods on Hassenfuss? Or even on the U.S. ambassador coordinating the Contra support, John Negroponte?
The international outrage, especially from the U.S., would have been deafening.
Exactly. Cries of barbarism, violations of international law, demands for justice. It starkly exposes the selective morality. Our side's actions are excused, justified, or ignored. Their side's identical actions are atrocities.
It comes back to that historical amnesia.
It does. Chomsky concludes that this amnesia is incredibly dangerous, not just because it undermines basic moral and intellectual integrity, but because, crucially, it lays the groundwork for crimes yet to come. If you don't reckon with the past, you're doomed to repeat it, or at least enable its repetition.
A very sobering thought. Forgetting or distorting history essentially gives a green light to future abuses. Okay, this deep dive into amnesia helps us understand the mindset, maybe? And Chomsky extends this analysis in section 3, the economic hand, geopolitical strategy, and public discontent.
Right. Shifting focus slightly to the economic drivers.
In chapter 4, The Invisible Hand of Power, he looks at the economic levers. He starts by contrasting popular uprisings like in Cairo's Tahrir Square, where people sought basic rights denied by a dictatorship.
Yeah, fundamental democratic rights.
With protests in Madison, Wisconsin, where public employees were defending rights they already had, rights that were under attack in one of the wealthiest nations on earth, what's the connection he's drawing?
It's a fascinating contrast. He sees both, though in very different settings, as struggles against concentrated power. In Cairo, it was obvious political power. In Madison, it was economic power, wielded by corporate interests and allied politicians, attacking established labor rights, pensions, collective bargaining.
So different contexts, same fundamental struggle against elite control.
That's how he frames it. And he argues this reflects a much broader, long-term U.S. geopolitical strategy focused on economic control. He goes back to World War II planners.
What was their plan?
They outlined what they called the Grand Area. This was the vast region they envisioned the U.S. dominating after the war. Initially, it was the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, and the former British Empire, crucially including Middle East oil resources.
Controlling the energy was key even then.
Absolutely central. And after the Battle of Stalingrad, when it looked like the Soviets would defeat Germany on the Eastern Front, these U.S. objectives expanded. The goal became incorporating most of Eurasia into this grand area. It's a blueprint for global economic and strategic dominance.
And securing resources remains central. You mentioned the Bush administration trying to secure privileges for U.S. investors in Iraq.
Exactly. Right after the invasion, they pushed for a statement of principles that would have guaranteed U.S. troops stay indefinitely and critically give American investors preferential treatment, especially in the oil sector.
But that didn't happen.
No. Those specific demands were eventually dropped because of intense Iraqi resistance. But it clearly shows the underlying economic motive: securing control over vital resources and markets for U.S. interests.
And it's not just direct control, it's also about shaping the political landscape, like in the Arab world.
Right. He points to opinion surveys often conducted by U.S. agencies themselves, but rarely publicized, showing that huge majorities of Arabs see the U.S. and Israel as the biggest threats they face, like 90% in Egypt, over 75% across the region.
That's the opposite of what their leaders often say publicly.
Completely the opposite. The dictatorships often align publicly with U.S. policy. This huge disconnect between the rulers and the ruled shows, Chomsky argues, why Western powers are fundamentally hostile to real democracy in the Arab world.
Because democratic governments might actually reflect that public opinion.
Precisely. And that would threaten Western control over energy resources and strategic positions. So the rhetoric is democracy promotion, but the reality, he argues, is maintaining compliant regimes for good reasons related to power and profit.
It feels like there's this hidden layer the public isn't supposed to see. And speaking of hidden meanings, Chomsky revisits Adam Smith's invisible hand, but he gives it a completely different spin than usual.
Yeah, this is one of his classic points. It's really eye-opening. He points out that Adam Smith, and the only place he actually uses that famous phrase in The Wealth of Nations.
Only once. I thought it was his main idea.
Only once in that book. And he used it not to celebrate free markets driving collective good, but as a warning.
A warning about what?
Smith was worried that if British merchants and manufacturers invested their capital abroad, chasing higher profits elsewhere, then Britain itself, their home country, would suffer from disinvestment.
So the opposite of globalization, almost.
Kind of. Smith hoped that a natural bias of proximity, a preference for investing at home where they understood the risks and felt some connection, would guide them. And that domestic investment, Smith hoped, would benefit the nation as if guided by an invisible hand.
So the invisible hand was about keeping capital at home.
That was Smith's context. Chomsky argues that modern interpretations completely ignore this. They twist Smith's idea to justify exactly what Smith feared: capital flowing anywhere for maximum profit, leading to the plundering and devastation of home communities.
So the masters of humanity, as Smith called them.
Yeah, the merchants and manufacturers.
Yeah.
Chomsky says they've now abandoned any sentimental concerns for their own societies, chasing short-term gains and bonuses, undermining the very national well-being Smith hoped the invisible hand, in his specific sense, would protect.
That completely reframes Adam Smith, from patron saint of free markets to a worried nationalist, almost. And this destructive pursuit of profit leads us straight to Chapter 6. Is this the end of the United States?
Another cheerful title.
Right. Chomsky argues that starting around the 1970s, the U.S. entered a period of self-inflicted and conscious decline. He blames a deliberate shift away from manufacturing towards finance, towards financialization, and offshoring production. Why did this happen?
He attributes it primarily to falling profit rates in domestic industry. So capital sought higher returns elsewhere in financial speculation or in lower-wage countries.
And this shift triggered a cycle.
A really vicious cycle, according to Chomsky, with huge consequences. As the economy tilted towards finance and jobs went overseas, wealth started concentrating dramatically at the very top, especially the top 0.1%.
The super rich got much richer.
Exponentially richer. And this extreme concentration of wealth led directly to a concentration of political power.
Because money buys influence, as the earlier studies showed.
Exactly. This newly concentrated political power was then used to pass laws that accelerated the trend. Major tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation, especially of finance, changes in corporate rules that boosted executive pay while suppressing wages.
So the rich use their power to get richer.
That's the feedback loop. And the result for the vast majority. Real wages stagnated or even declined. People had to work longer hours just to tread water, way more than in Europe. They took on huge amounts of debt, mortgages, credit cards, student loans.
And unemployment.
For many communities, especially those deindustrialized, unemployment remains stuck at levels you'd normally associate with a depression.
It sounds like a deliberate hollowing out of the middle and working classes. And this led to that Citigroup concept, the plutonomy.
Yeah, the plutonomy concept is fascinating because it came from within the system. Citigroup analysts wrote reports describing global society splitting into two: the plutonomy, the tiny sliver of the ultra-rich, and the rest.
And this wasn't a critique.
No, it was investment advice. They told their clients to focus on the plutonomy, on the luxury goods and services the super-rich consume. They even created a plutonomy stock basket, tracking these companies.
And how did it perform?
It significantly outperformed the regular market indexes, especially since the mid-'80s, when Reagan and Thatcher's economic programs really kicked in.
Yeah.
It was basically a strategy acknowledging that inequality was the driving force and betting on it continuing.
Wow. Investing in inequality. And the government, in this picture, isn't helping the rest, is it? Chomsky calls it a nanny state for the rich.
That's his phrase, yeah. He points to things like the massive taxpayer-funded bailouts for banks and corporations after the 2008 financial crisis. They took huge risks, they failed, and the public picked up the tab because they were too big to fail.
Losses are socialized, profits are privatized.
That's the essence of it. But at the same time, these same institutions and the politicians they fund preach the gospel of market principles for everyone else. You know, Hayek, Friedman cut social programs. Individuals are on their own, sink or swim.
A massive double standard. Protection for the powerful, harsh market discipline for the weak.
Exactly. And when people are sinking, when economic hardship bites, who gets blamed?
Historically, it's often immigrants, right? The outsider.
That's a classic pattern. Chomsky argues it's especially potent now, fueled partly by anxieties among some white Americans about becoming a minority in the country. Economic pain gets redirected towards a convenient scapegoat.
Instead of blaming the policies or the system that caused the pain.
Right. The perception is fostered that immigrants are taking jobs or draining resources, rather than focusing on, say, corporations offshoring jobs or decades of wage suppression. He uses NAFTA as an example.
The North American Free Trade Agreement, how does that fit in?
He argues it was sold as free trade, but it was really more of an investor rights agreement. It protected corporations moving production to Mexico for cheaper labor, but it didn't protect workers or the environment much.
And the impact in Mexico?
It devastated large parts of Mexican agriculture, forcing many rural people off their land. Where did they go? Many had little choice but to try and cross the border into the U.S. seeking work.
So the policy created more migration.
It contributed significantly. And then, Chomsky argues, this influx fuels an anti-immigration hysteria back in the U.S., particularly among those very workers whose own livelihoods were hurt by the same corporate and state policies that incentivized offshoring and suppressed wages. The anger gets deflected.
Anger is redirected away from the architects of the economic problems towards the victims of those same problems. That's a crucial point. Okay, let's shift gears again. Section 4 takes us into the rule of law, double standards, and media manipulation.
Back to history and how it's used or abused.
Chapter 7 is titled Magna Carta, Its Fate and Ours. Chomsky doesn't just focus on the famous Magna Carta, but highlights a companion document from 1759, the Charter of the Forest. Why is this lesser-known charter important?
It's hugely important because it protected something fundamental. The commons. The shared resources, forests, pastures, water that ordinary people depended on for their survival.
Things not privately owned.
Exactly. The Charter of the Forest aimed to protect these common resources from being seized or enclosed by external powers, back then the king and powerful barons. Chomsky argues its principles are incredibly relevant today.
Oh, so?
He sees a direct parallel between the historical enclosure of the commons and modern efforts by predatory corporations and collaborating state authorities to privatize everything: water, seeds, knowledge, even the internet. He argues the destruction of the Charter of the Forest, its erasure from memory, is part of a long-term project to restrict the public sphere and undermine the idea of shared resources and collective well-being.
It connects to the erosion of the public good we see today.
Very much so. And it contrasts with the promise of the Magna Carta itself, Article 39. No free man could be imprisoned or punished except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land.
Due process, trial by jury, the presumption of innocence.
The absolute bedrock of Anglo-American liberty, as legal historians call it. It was enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. But
There's always a but with the Constitution in this analysis, isn't there?
there is. Chomsky immediately points to the massive contradiction built into the Constitution from day one. The 3/5 clause.
Counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation.
Yes. Which ironically gave slave owners more political power in Congress than non-slave states. He even argues that protecting slavery from potential British abolition efforts was a significant, though often downplayed, factor pushing Southern colonies towards independence.
He quotes Dr. Samuel Johnson.
Yeah, that devastating quip. We hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of slaves. It highlights the profound hypocrisy at the founding, proclaiming universal liberty while enshrining chattel slavery.
And even after the Civil War amendments formally ended slavery and granted citizenship.
The legacy persisted. De facto slavery, through sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, continued in many ways right up until World War II.
And economically.
Even when African Americans made some gains, Chomsky points out how the neoliberal shift from the 70s onwards disproportionately eroded those gains. And then the 2008 housing crash virtually wiped out whatever scarce wealth Black communities had managed to accumulate.
So there's a direct line from historical injustice to modern inequality.
He draws that line very clearly, and he connects these historical violations, the 35th Clause, slavery, Jim Crow, economic discrimination, to contemporary issues like Guantanamo, indefinite detention, denial of due process. These aren't new problems, he argues. They're modern manifestations of a long-standing pattern of denying fundamental rights to certain groups when it suits the powerful.
It's a continuous thread of undermining the rule of law for specific targets. This theme of double standards and selective memory explodes in Chapter 20, A Day in the Life of a New York Times Reader. This is his famous media critique.
Yes, where he dissects how mainstream media covers or doesn't cover certain events.
He uses the downing of two civilian airliners as a prime example: Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 and Iran Air Flight 655. How does the coverage compare?
The contrast is absolutely stark and deliberately chosen by Chomsky. MH17 shot down over Ukraine in 2014, 298 dead, widely blamed on Russia or Russian-backed forces. It received massive, sustained front-page coverage, intense outrage, detailed investigations reported daily.
Okay, a major international incident, understandably covered heavily.
Right. Now compare that to Iran Air Flight 655. Shot down in 1988 by a U.S. Navy guided missile cruiser, the USS Vincennes, over Iranian territorial waters. 290 people killed, including 66 children.
Also a major incident with huge civilian casualties. How was that covered?
Minimal attention. Quickly faded from the news. President Reagan essentially blamed the Iranians for flying near a warship, and the U.S. commander of the Vincennes and the specific officer who gave the fire order were later awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct during their tour.
They were given medals after shooting down a civilian airliner.
Yes. The contrast in coverage, in official reaction, in accountability, it's breathtaking. For Chomsky, it perfectly illustrates selective outrage. The perpetrator matters more than the act itself.
And this isn't just a one-off example, is it? He does the same with terrorism coverage.
Exactly. He compares the intense horror and outrage of unspeakable proportions expressed after the 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris, which were indeed horrific,
Absolutely.
with the reaction, or lack thereof, to NATO's bombing of the Serbian State Television Headquarters, RTS, in Belgrade in 1999 during the Kosovo War. That was a deliberate attack on a civilian media outlet, killing 16 employees.
Which would likely be considered a war crime?
Under international law, yes. But how was it framed by NATO? A spokesman called the bombing tremendously important and, I believe, positive.
Yeah.
Again, who does the killing determines the moral judgment and the media narrative.
He also mentions the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris.
Yes, described in the West as possibly the most threatening attack against journalism in living memory, which it was, a terrible attack. But Chomsky contrasts the massive global reaction to that with the routine, systematic murder of journalists in places like Honduras or Mexico, often with state complicity.
Where the per capita rate of journalist killings is far higher.
Far higher, but receives almost no sustained attention or comparable outrage in the West.
So Chomsky boils this down to a general principle governing media coverage and public indignation. What is it?
It's a pretty damning summary. He says the principle, observed with impressive dedication and consistency, is basically this. The more we can attribute crimes to enemies, the greater our indignation, the greater our responsibility for crimes, and the more we can do to stop them, the less the concern tending towards oblivion.
Wow. Blame the enemy, ignore our own crimes. It's a chilling principle. How does he then apply this lens to the Iranian threat?
Well, that principle perfectly explains, for him, why Iran is constantly portrayed in the West as the single greatest threat to world peace. He calls it a Western obsession.
An obsession not shared elsewhere.
Crucially, he points out, it's not seen that way in the Arab world, nor in Asia. He urges us to look at the motives behind this Western obsession, suggesting it's driven by geopolitical interests, not objective assessment of threat.
So the media's selective focus, the historical amnesia, bills this perception of Iran as uniquely dangerous. What about actual solutions to nuclear proliferation in the region?
He highlights a very sensible proposal that gets almost zero attention in the West. A proposal originally pushed by Egypt decades ago and repeatedly endorsed by non-aligned nations and the UN General Assembly, establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the entire Middle East.
Applying to everyone, Iran, Israel, everyone.
Yes. It would require all states in the region, including Israel, widely believed to possess nuclear weapons, though it doesn't confirm or deny, to renounce nuclear weapons and accept inspections.
That sounds like a direct way to address the issue. Why is it ignored?
Well, it receives virtually no coverage in Western media. Chomsky implies it's ignored because it would constrain U.S. allies, primarily Israel, and limit U.S. strategic options. Meanwhile, you have U.S. politicians making wildly exaggerated claims about Iran, like Senator Ted Cruz warning Iran could kill tens of millions of Americans with an EMP weapon.
While Iran's actual military capability is much lower.
Dramatically lower. Its military budget is a tiny fraction of Saudi Arabia's and significantly less than even the UAE's. The disparity between the rhetoric and the reality is vast. For Chomsky, it proves the threat is largely manufactured to justify U.S. and Israeli regional dominance and military spending, not based on credible danger.
It's about manufacturing consent for certain policies. That's a powerful critique of how threats are framed. It makes you question everything you hear, which leads us perfectly into Section 5, Existential Threats and the Future of Power.
The really big picture dangers.
Chapter 15, How Many Minutes to Midnight, tackles nuclear brinkmanship head-on. Chomsky uses this striking framing device. If aliens wrote our history, they might divide it into AAN, before atomic nuclei, and EAN, era of atomic nuclei, starting August 6, 1945.
A sobering way to mark the moment humanity gained the power to destroy itself. It fundamentally changed everything.
He then re-examines the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguing it didn't just pop up. He says it began with Kennedy's terrorist attack on Cuba. What does he mean?
He's referring to Operation Mongoose, the large-scale campaign of CIA-sponsored sabotage, terrorism, assassination attempts, and economic warfare against Cuba, combined with credible threats of a full U.S. invasion, which were peaking in October 1962.
So the Soviet missiles were placed in response to that U.S. aggression.
That's his argument, that Khrushchev placed the missiles defensively in response to the very real threat of a U.S. invasion aimed at overthrowing Castro, and also to counterbalance U.S. missiles already placed in Turkey, right on the Soviet border.
And the resolution involved a secret deal?
Yes. The crisis ended when Khrushchev offered a public deal. Soviets remove missiles from Cuba if the U.S. guarantees not to invade Cuba. Kennedy publicly agreed. But Khrushchev also demanded the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy agreed to that too, but only in secret.
Why secretly?
To preserve the image of U.S. strength and avoid looking like he'd made a concession under pressure, the American public wasn't told about the missile swap for many years.
So diplomacy, even secret diplomacy, saved the day. But did Kennedy learn from this near catastrophe?
Chomsky argues he didn't, really. He points out that Khrushchev later proposed a concrete plan for mutual reductions in offensive weapons, a real chance to de-escalate. But the Kennedy administration rejected it.
They chose rearmament instead.
They undertook a gigantic armament program, massively expanding the U.S. nuclear arsenal, despite having just stared into the abyss. Kennedy himself estimated the probability of war during the crisis at 50-50. Eisenhower warned it could destroy the Northern Hemisphere. Yet the choice was escalation.
And this period solidified a doctrine.
Yes, the doctrine that the U.S. has the right, even the duty, to use military force unilaterally to increment its economic interests, securing markets, resources, strategic positions, the when we have to be doctrine, justifying interventionism.
And this mindset didn't end with the Cold War.
Not at all. He points to a chilling Pentagon Stratcom study from 1995 after the Soviet Union had collapsed, called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence.
What did it recommend?
It explicitly advocated maintaining U.S. global primacy. And disturbingly, it suggested the U.S. should cultivate a national persona of being irrational and vindictive in its use of power, to keep potential adversaries off balance and intimidated, projecting unpredictability as a strategic tool.
That sounds incredibly dangerous. And the risks today?
Chomsky argues, citing figures like former Pentagon Chief William Perry, not Borger, the original outline, but Perry is often cited on this, that the risk of nuclear war is actually higher now than during much of the Cold War, partly due to decaying command systems, false alarms, and increasing geopolitical tensions.
He mentions near misses.
Yes, historical examples like the 1979 NORAD computer error that simulated a Soviet attack, or 1995 incident where a Norwegian scientific rocket was mistaken for a potential nuclear launch by Russian systems. Human or technical error could trigger catastrophe.
And current policies are exacerbating risks, like NATO expansion.
He strongly echoes critics like George Kennan, the architect of containment, who called NATO expansion into Eastern Europe a tragic error, a political mistake of historical proportions.
Why?
Because pushing a hostile military alliance right up to Russia's borders, especially dangling membership for Ukraine and Georgia, was predictably seen by Russia as a major security threat. Chomsky argues this directly fuels the current confrontation and increases the risk of miscalculation or escalation between nuclear powers.
He mentions specific recent incidents, too.
Yeah, things like U.S. bombers flying near disputed islands claimed by China in the South China Sea, or U.S. military vehicles parading provocatively near the Russian border in Estonia. These aren't accidents. They're calculated moves that ratchet up tensions to Cold War levels, making conflict more likely.
It's like we're sleepwalking towards disaster. And if nuclear war isn't enough, Chapter 22, the Doomsday Clock, Revisited Climate Catastrophe, brings in the other existential threat.
Right. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved their symbolic clock very close to midnight, citing both nuclear dangers and the accelerating climate crisis.
How bad is the climate situation, according to the science Chomsky presents?
It's dire. He points to data showing record increases in CO2 emissions, exceeding even the worst-case IPCC scenarios at the time. Polar ice melt is accelerating faster than predicted, driving sea level rise and reducing the planet's reflectivity, which causes even more warming, a dangerous feedback loop.
This isn't theoretical anymore.
Not at all. It's happening now. More extreme weather, droughts, floods impacting vulnerable populations disproportionately.
And how do the masters of humanity, the powerful interests, connect to this?
Chomsky argues the same concentration of power and wealth that drives geopolitical conflict also drives environmental destruction. Policies are shaped by short-term profit motives, prioritizing fossil fuel extraction and consumption over long-term planetary health.
He gives examples.
Bangladesh is a key example. Low-lying, densely populated, incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. Also, the melting Himalayan glaciers, threatening water supplies for hundreds of millions in South Asia, India, already facing severe water stress.
Yet the public debate is often confusing.
Exactly. The issue gets framed in the media as if there's a legitimate debate between alarmists and skeptics, sowing doubt and delaying action. And crucially, he points out that the U.S. The richest and most powerful country in world history was, at the time he was writing, the only major nation without a national policy to restrict fossil fuel use.
That is astounding. The richest country, arguably causing the most historical pollution, doing the least structurally.
It highlights the immense power of the fossil fuel lobby and related industries to block meaningful climate action, even when the scientific consensus is overwhelming.
Even President Obama's rhetoric sometimes fell short.
Chomsky criticizes Obama's 2012 State of the Union, where he celebrated the prospect of a century of energy self-sufficiency through fracking and tar sands extraction technologies, with severe environmental consequences, framing it as a national triumph despite the climate warnings.
It shows how deeply embedded these interests are, overriding even existential threats. Okay, these huge threats bring us to our final section, Section 6. The dynamics of power and public discontent in modern times.
Looking at more recent political developments through this lens.
Chapter 18 discusses Obama's historic measure on Cuba. The 2014 announcement normalizing relations was widely praised, right? Obama acknowledged the old isolation policy failed, called for engagement.
It was definitely presented as a major breakthrough, historic even.
But Chomsky digs deeper. What was the reality behind the rhetoric?
He argues that while the rhetoric shifted, the substance didn't change nearly as much. The punishing economic embargo, the core of the hostile policy, largely remained in place, opposed by virtually the entire world except for the U.S. and Israel.
So mostly symbolic.
A significant symbolic step, but masking a deep continuity. Chomsky reminds us of the long history of U.S. aggression going back to the 19th century desire to annex Cuba, intensifying after Castro's revolution with Kennedy's terrorist attacks, Operation Mongoose, endless assassination plots, decades of economic strangulation.
The goal is always regime change.
Consistently, yes. To tighten the screws, as official documents put it. And why? What was the core reason, according to the CIA reports Chomsky cites?
Not human rights abuses, primarily.
Not according to the internal documents. The primary fear was Cuba's insolent and successful challenge to U.S. dominance in the hemisphere. The fear that Cuba, despite the embargo, might offer a successful alternative model of development, prioritizing health and education, and inspire other Latin American nations to break free from U.S. control.
It was the threat of a good example, essentially.
That's exactly how Chomsky frames it. The fear of defiance, of independence, of an alternative path succeeding was intolerable to U.S. planners focused on maintaining hegemony.
And he contrasts this U.S. view with how others saw Cuba, like Nelson Mandela.
Yes, that Mandela quote is incredibly powerful. He called Cuba an inspiration during his imprisonment, Castro, a tower of strength. He credited Cuban military victories in Africa, particularly against the South African Army in Angola, with, quote, destroying the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressor and inspiring the anti-apartheid struggle.
And he asked that amazing question.
What other country can point to a history of greater altruism than Cuba has demonstrated in its relations with Africa? It's a perspective completely absent from mainstream Western discourse, highlighting the profound double standards and historical amnesia surrounding Cuba.
It really flips the narrative. This brings us to the contemporary rise of populism and public anger. Chomsky connects Trump's election, Brexit, and the rise of far-right parties in Europe. Figures like Farage, Le Pen, Orban saw Trump as one of their kind. What's the common thread?
The common thread Chomsky identifies is deep-seated public anger and discontent, particularly among segments of the white working and lower middle classes in Western societies.
Anger about what?
Anger about feeling left behind, economically abandoned, feeling their jobs, their communities, their sense of dignity and self-worth have been destroyed over decades by neoliberal economic policies, the very policies we discussed earlier that benefited the plutonomy.
So Trump and similar figures tapped into this legitimate economic grievance.
They absolutely tapped into it. These voters felt, often correctly, that the government, run by establishment elites of both main parties, was complicit in the policies that harmed them: offshoring, deunionization, financial deregulation.
But Chomsky also points out how this anger gets misdirected, right? The doctrinarian system's accomplishment.
Yes, this is crucial. He argues a major success of the dominant ideology, the doctrinarian system, has been to deflect that anger away from the corporate sector, which largely designs and benefits from these policies, and towards the government that implements them. Or even towards other scapegoats.
Like immigrants, as we discussed.
Exactly, or towards cultural elites or minorities.
Yeah.
He also emphasizes the powerful role of white supremacy and cultural anxiety in the U.S. context.
How so?
He cites studies suggesting that underlying beliefs in white supremacy remain incredibly influential, perhaps even more so than in apartheid South Africa. Fears stoked about a declining white majority, about attacks on traditional conservative culture, often defined in racialized and nationalistic terms, create fertile ground for demagogues who blend economic populism with cultural and racial resentment.
A potent mix.
Yep.
And the economic grievances are real, not just feelings. He uses the minimum wage example again.
Right. He reminds us the U.S. minimum wage used to track productivity growth back in the 50s and 60s. If it had continued to do so, it would be around $20 an hour today, instead of the low single digits it was for years, or the struggle to even get it to $15, which gets framed as some kind of radical political revolution. It shows how far expectations have been lowered, how much groundworking people have lost.
And it's not just about money, is it? It's about dignity.
Absolutely. The shift from stable manufacturing jobs, often unionized, with decent pay and benefits, to precarious, low-wage service jobs. That involves a profound loss of dignity, of home for the future, of a sense of purpose and community. That vacuum is easily filled by anger and resentment, expertly channeled by populist leaders.
What a sobering analysis of our current moment, grounded in decades of history and policy. It's been a truly profound and often quite unsettling deep dive into Noam Chomsky's Comanda no Mundo.
It really has. We've touched on the hidden structures of global power, the dangers of forgetting or rewriting history, the devastating impact of certain economic policies, the double standards in law and media, and these huge existential threats we face.
Yeah, Chomsky's work fundamentally challenges us to look past the headlines, doesn't it? To question the assumptions about who really holds power and why the world is the way it is.
It absolutely does. And given his whole analysis how concentrated power, selective history, and media narratives shape everything, it leaves us, maybe you listening, with a really pressing question. If the masters of humanity, as he calls them, consistently prioritize their own short-term interest over dealing with existential threats like nuclear war and climate catastrophe, what can we actually do? What immediate concrete steps can you take right where you are, in your community, your workplace, your sphere of influence?
How can we challenge these patterns? Advocate for something better, more just, more sustainable.
Exactly. What if real change doesn't start with some grand global shift, but with us? With informed people getting together, demanding truth, demanding accountability, acting collectively, even on a smaller scale.
That's definitely something to mull over. The idea that the power and the responsibility might ultimately lie with us, with informed collective action. We really encourage you to reflect on these insights, see how they resonate with your own view of the world.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of critical inquiry today. We really value your attention and your engagement.
We certainly do.
And if you found this deep dive thought-provoking, maybe a little unsettling, please do share it with others who you think might benefit from hearing this perspective.
That'll work.
And for more insightful discussions, more challenging ideas, make sure you subscribe to the English BookCast channel.
We'd love to have you back.
We look forward to having you with us on our next deep dive.